Buongiorno o buonasera a tutti. Mi chiamo Isabella. Sono una dottoranda presso l'Università del New South Wales. Vivo a Sydney. Sono australiana. Mio padre è italiano, quindi conosco un po' l'italiano, ma per questa presentazione parlerò in inglese. English speaking now. My name is Isabella. I'm a PhD student at the University of New South Wales, and my research focuses on performance anxiety, which is what we'll be talking about today. So I'm going to get straight into it and start by defining what music performance anxiety. So it's commonly defined as the experience of persisting distressful apprehension and or actual impairment of performance skills in a public context to a degree unwarranted given the individual's musical aptitude, training, and level of preparation. Now, this is a quote from someone quite famous who experienced performance anxiety. They state, "I am not fitted to give concerts. The audience intimidates me. I feel choked by its breath, paralyzed by its curious glances, struck dumb by all those strange faces." And this came from Frédéric Chopin. So this really just shows that performance anxiety is something that can impact the most talented musicians out there. Chopin is a renowned composer and pianist, and even he experienced performance anxiety. It's just that unwarranted nature of it, that no matter your level of training or ability, it can get to any of us, really. There are various short-term impacts of performance anxiety that are grouped into the following categories: physiological, behavioral, and cognitive. And it's important to note that these don't just relate to music performance anxiety, but performance anxiety in other disciplines. So that could be dance, theatre, sport, public speaking, even day-to-day activities. And these short-term symptoms can lead to long-term impacts. Music performance anxiety, or MPA, which I'll be referring to it throughout this presentation, can have debilitating effects on not only musicians' performance, but also their general well-being. And as a result, musicians are more likely to suffer from mental health problems and psychological distress compared to the general workforce. And ultimately, this can prevent a musician from pursuing a musical career or even performing just for fun. So because of these short-term and long-term impacts of MPA, it's important to look at how musicians cope with performance anxiety. So many studies analyze what strategies are most commonly used by musicians, but few examine the efficacy of these strategies and look at which are most effective at actually mitigating MPA. It's also important to consider how effective the strategies are based on who is using them, particularly based on the extent to which they experience MPA, whether they experience high performance anxiety or low performance anxiety. And this is what we'll look at in the first half of this presentation, where I will go over my empirical research on this topic that I conducted in 2019. Then I will be looking at the literature on how others, being music educators, support their students with performance anxiety. There isn't much out there on this topic, as you will see, but we'll be looking at what strategies are used and whether there is a role for teachers in this space. So we'll get into part one, musicians and performance anxiety. So the objectives of this study was to understand what types of strategies were used by participants with low and high MPA, and to analyze how effective these strategies are at managing MPA. So to do this, I conducted a study with 102 musicians from the following institutions in Australia. You can see that majority of them were female, and they were mostly pianists and woodwind players. So basically, they just had to complete one online questionnaire, which asked a range of demographic questions, and then there was a free text response question where they were able to describe up to 3 strategies that they commonly use to manage performance anxiety and to rate the effectiveness of these strategies. And the effectiveness was measured on a Likert type scale, ranging from never effective to always effective. And the free text question was used so that the musicians could freely write their own strategies rather than being influenced by a list of strategies and just simply tick a box. The Kenny Music Performance Anxiety Inventory was used to measure anxiety levels. And this is a widely established scale that's commonly used to measure music performance anxiety. It is quite lengthy with 40 statements that need to be answered. And it covers not only performance-related questions, but also the personal history of the respondent and other factors that might influence performance anxiety. I also developed a scale for this study called the Mazzarolo Music Performance Anxiety Scale. And this is just a 5-item scale that was used to get a rapid, pinpointed assessment of MPA levels. And here you can see the statements that are asked, and a higher score out of 30 indicates a greater level of MPA. So generally scores above 15 was high performance anxiety, and scores below were low performance anxiety. And a Pearson product moment correlation test was run to determine whether there was a correlation between the Kenny Music Performance Anxiety Inventory scores and the scores of this scale. And as indicated by the high R value, as it's close to 0.1, there was a significant positive correlation between the scores of both inventories. So we can say that this newly developed scale is a reliable and valid scale that can be used. And I'll be using that scale for the remainder of this presentation. So then a whole lot of categorization basically happened in order to group the free text response questions or the answers that asked what coping strategies they used. So you can see here statements like longer warm-up, practice sections that cause the most trouble, good preparation. We group these as performance practice strategies. So that's how we categorize them. And we converted them into 22 categories, which we then grouped these categories into themes. And we called them the COPE NVI themes. So this is based off the Coping Orientation to Problems Experienced New Italian version. And this is a framework that has often been used outside of music contexts to examine the coping strategies used by people in stressful situations. So it's avoidance strategies, focus on problem, positive attitude, social support, and transcendence. So we thought this would be a nice framework to group our data into. And we also added these two, breathing and physiological, just because these categories didn't quite fit into the existing ones. So we grouped it that way instead. Okay, getting into the results now. So objective 1, which was to understand what types of strategies were used by participants with low and high MPA. We used an ANOVA test to determine whether there were statistically significant differences between the means of the independent variables, which were the coping strategies here, and the anxiety levels, which again, remember, closer to 30 means high performance anxiety and under 15, low performance anxiety. So it was found that participants with high performance anxiety, 18 was the mean here, used avoidance strategies, whereas participants with low performance anxiety used positive attitude as a strategy to cope with performance anxiety. And we can see there's a statistically significant difference because between the means here, as the significance value, the p-value is 0.009, which is below 0.05. And we can further see which specific groups are different through a Tukey multiple comparison test, which again shows a statistically significant difference between avoidance strategies and positive attitude. And I thought I would just explain the stats around that because I know some of those watching have research background and some don't, but yeah, we'll continue on to objective 2, which was to analyze how effective participants' coping strategies were at managing MPA. And again, an ANOVA test was conducted for this, and we can see that attitude and focus on problem had the higher effectiveness scores. They're not crazy high, it's 70 and 73. But on the contrary, avoidance strategies had the lowest rating of effectiveness with around 50. So this would be out of 100. And again, it was statistically significant, and we can see this, that between avoidance strategies and positive attitude and avoidance strategies and focus on problem, there was a statistically significant difference there. So we can say that high MPA participants, musicians who have high performance anxiety levels, used avoidance strategies, which actually had the lowest effectiveness scores. And this is similar to a study by Biasutti and Conchina, where they found that high MPA participants used avoidance strategies to cope with performance anxiety. And this might be because individuals who suffer from performance anxiety often adopt a threat mindset and aim to reduce their anxiety. However, musicians with high MPA experience high arousal feelings. So trying to avoid MPA and distract themselves could be ineffective, as these strategies are associated with low arousal. So distraction here was things like, avoidance was things like distraction, suppressing, basically pushing all the negative emotions away. And again, this was backed up by Brooks, who found that high arousal feelings and low arousal feelings are not arousal congruent. So rather than reducing performance anxiety, avoidance strategies can create maladaptive arousal and therefore are ineffective at managing MPA. Now, looking at participants with low performance anxiety, they used positive attitude as a coping strategy, and this had a moderate effectiveness score. So positive attitude here is things like reappraisal, so rethinking the negative thoughts into positive thoughts, acceptance, positive thinking, that kind of thing. And perhaps the reason why this was only moderate was because more awareness and training may be required to effectively use these strategies. And this is backed up again by research by Munzel, Osborne, and Greenaway, who found that although participants aimed to use reappraisal as a way to cope with MPA, it was actually rarely used in practice. And this might be because the context and time in which reappraisal is being implemented in can influence its effectiveness in reducing MPA. So whether positive attitude is effective or not may depend upon the time of implementation and whether an individual has had sufficient training in using it as an emotion regulation strategy. So overall, we can say that musicians with high performance anxiety used avoidance strategies, and these were the least effective at managing MPA, whereas musicians with low performance anxiety used positive attitude strategies, which were more effective at managing MPA. Overall, though, focusing on the problem had the highest effectiveness scores, which was used by participants with around a medium level of performance anxiety. And this focusing on the problem included categories mostly related to practicing. So perhaps musicians are more comfortable using a strategy like this because it is something that comes quite naturally to them. When they think of an area of the piece that they're nervous about, they'll often just repeat that practice over and over. So it's a quite natural strategy to use. There were, of course, limitations with this study. Only one questionnaire was used to gather the data, and it was based on self-report of the participants. So there are other ways that might be more reliable at getting this type of data. And there's always bias and subjectivity with categorizing. So although the free text responses were good in order to allow the participants to freely write themselves, it does involve the process of categorization, and that might involve some bias here and there. And then there is this question around whether the effective coping strategy actually causes the participants' level of performance anxiety, or whether the performance anxiety causes the effective coping strategy. So this is an area for future work that, is unanswered in this study, but something to consider. So we've looked at what musicians are doing for themselves, and there's a lot of research on this. And that's not surprising, given that musicians are often expected to cope with performance anxiety on their own. MPA is often brushed aside as widely accepted and just a normal part of a musician's life. But it's important to take a step back and look at the other factors around them that might contribute to how they manage MPA or their anxiety levels. So that's what we'll be doing now. In part 2, we'll be looking at educators and their role with performance anxiety. So upon looking at the literature that investigates how musicians cope with performance anxiety on their own, authors often conclude with suggestions that teachers should address this topic with their students. And this is not necessarily based off their research, but more as general remarks for future directions. But whether they are doing this is another question. And interestingly, some studies have attributed differences in MPA levels between different institutions due to pedagogical differences, suggesting that some institutions might be more successful in reducing MPA or not contributing to MPA. So maybe we should take a closer look at the influence of pedagogy and MPA here. And similarly, researchers highlight that performance anxiety might be attributed to various factors such as training, ability, trait anxiety, but also performance settings. And when they look at performance settings, it's more about rehearsals and concerts, but also practice and in the studio is something to be considered, and the possible influence that teachers could have in this space on performance anxiety. So we're going to be kind of going through a literature review here now on what is out there on the topic and how that feeds into the study that I'm currently conducting. So currently I've just found 3 studies that specifically investigate how music teachers support their students with MPA. And interestingly, of these 3 studies, only one examines this from the teacher's perspectives. That's this one here by Seeger, and it was just with 3 teachers. The others examine it from the student's perspective, and they were undergraduate music students in these cases. I then have found some studies that make note of how teachers, the strategies that they use, though they weren't exactly investigating this topic in detail, but they did have a question on their survey, which gave some interesting ideas. So I'll be referring to these ones later. So the studies showed that there was a complexity between the teacher and student relationship and whether students could open up about MPA with their teachers. The study by Tahir Beghi found that some students shared experiences of MPA with their teachers, while others did not. And that's because some teachers met the students at an emotional level, whereas others just focused on technical skill, which you can see in these quotes here. In the study by Cornett and Uren that I mentioned earlier, they asked one question in their survey, which was, what resources would you like to help you perform with greater confidence? And one student responded by saying, sometimes I'm afraid of my teacher. I wish there could be a school counselor and a specific course where we can share this situation with our friends. And then in the study by Seeger, one teacher avoided the topic of MPA in fear that it would actually increase the possibility of occurrence. So here it was the teacher that was reluctant to open up with the student because of the possible stigma around the topic and fear that it would make it actually worse. So this really begs the question of whether teachers do have a responsibility to play in the topic of performance anxiety with their students, or whether students want to look at different resources for this help. The studies also showed that there are MPA strategies used by teachers with their students. However, most of these strategies are from personal experience or self-exploration, so through just what they've learnt along the way. And personal experience is, of course, valuable, but the teachers in the study by Seeger did highlight that they felt they could benefit from further training or knowledge on this topic. And there's also the question around whether teachers themselves have overcome performance anxiety themselves or not. There is this assumption that those who can't perform teach. And so perhaps there are a heap of teachers out there who don't feel comfortable discussing this topic just because they themselves feel that they might not be able to because they themselves haven't overcome it. So there are some potential reasons why it may be avoided. But in summary, we can say that, yes, some students and teachers feel comfortable opening up about MPA while others do not. And there is some evidence of strategies that are used by teachers to support their students with MPA, but they could benefit from further training and support on this topic. But what is really missing here is a widespread analysis. As I mentioned earlier, we've only really looked at this in detail with 3 teachers. So what I will be doing is questionnaires and interviews with a wide range of music educators to get a more widespread picture of MPA management across music education. And I aim to answer the following research questions. How do music educators support their students with performance anxiety? Are there any challenges in music educators addressing performance anxiety with their students? And do music educators believe they have a responsibility to support their students with performance anxiety? As well as this, I'll be looking to see whether there is any relationship between specific traits of teachers and whether this might contribute to MPA in their students. It is known that MPA manifests early in music learning and that it results from an interaction of heritable traits and learning experiences. And these experiences might be related to the following traits that could be held by teachers. So this being perfectionism, self-efficacy, or competition. So I'm currently working on a scale that taps into these ideas to see whether teachers have qualities that relate to these topics. And I'll be using statistical tests to see whether there's any correlation between these and maybe the strategies that they use to help their students cope with MPA, or even the MPA levels of their students. And ultimately, the aim of all this is to create more awareness and understanding on the role that teachers might play in performance anxiety manifestations for musicians, and to help educators better support their students with performance anxiety so that it can be controlled in an effective way to help musicians to perform at their very best. And that is it. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now. Are we going to do questions?
Wow, Isabella, thank you very much, first of all, for this fantastic presentation. Well, I found it really very interesting. Also, because being a musician, I fear music performance anxiety, and yes, the point of view of the teacher is very interesting, and I hope that many other results will come out, because yes, the way a teacher establish a relationship with his pupil also influences his way of perceiving music performance anxiety. In a way, I feel that well, if you are too much focused on perfectionism, then when you are on a stage, you are always in a way feeling this sensation of being in a way of an inadequacy or well something like that. And so one first thing I think is to understand that it's impossible to be perfect, and that you have to accept your mistakes in a way. And also, well, in my experience, something that really helps me avoiding music performance anxiety is the factor of concentrating on the music, and put all my thoughts about the fact of being able to realize some ideas of the composer. This thing, if this aspect engages your mind totally, then you can no longer be afraid of the public or or thinking about. But it's very difficult because there are many factors that influence that terrible moment before going on the stage. And so yes, well, of course, from my point of view, your presentation was really very helpful, and also I hope that many students from the conservatories of Italy will look at your presentation, and maybe I can write your email in order that if someone
Yeah, of course. Yeah, very happy to answer any other questions on the topic. There's a lot of research out there on this, but it hasn't exactly been translated so that it's, you know, easy for a musician to work out, okay, how do I cope with performance anxiety? They have to read a whole empirical study and scroll through all this and stuff so that they can get their answer. Yeah, so I think it's just making it more awareness that there's a lot of answers out there, and so that they can put that into real life, really. I think you froze a bit, Madalena. Oh, she's gone. Oh, I feel like I've got a fan club here. Oh, no. You're back.
Yes, I lost the connection. Oh, terrible. Yes. So if there are other questions, well.
Hi, Sandra.
I just worked out the button, sorry. That was fantastic, Isabella. Just want to add, I can't wait for you to do the next part. And also there'd be many workshops you could do with Amy B or Ansgar or whoever when they have their presentations and, you know, things that they have. So yeah, this is really needed. I need it too. So
yeah. AMEB is actually helping me. They've distributed my survey out to a pool, their pool of teachers, which is great. You probably got an email, Sandra.
If you find it, can you send it to me? Okay, that'd be great. Terrific. Yeah, definitely. Sure. That's great. Oh, I'll send it on to Ansgar and let them send it out to their pool as well. That would be terrific.
Wonderful. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Send me whatever I need to send to them. So yeah.
Sure. Sure.
Really good.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'll ask one. I was wondering whether you found in your studies if there was a correlation between either those who had severe performance anxiety and the length of time that they had been studying music for?
I think I would have the data on that, but I didn't report on
Analyze it, yeah.
Yeah,
I was just curious because I find that sometimes the younger they start, they get so used to it at a young age that they're better off. Whereas if they start later, they're more self-conscious. So it's kind of a given.
Yeah.
I was curious to see if it reflected that.
Yeah, a lot of the research shows that it can get worse with age and experience, surprisingly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, just like, because I think it's it could depend on a whole range of things, but coming from high school, then you go to conservatoire level, and then all of a sudden you're with, you know, the bar is set a lot higher.
Yeah,
And so
fair.
that you're more experienced, but your anxiety actually gets worse.
Yeah.
But it
cool.
would be interesting to see whether like the difference between adults who maybe have just started.
Yeah.
Yeah, compared to someone who's performed for a while.
Awesome. Thank you.
No worries. I think Madeline is catching up.
Yes, okay. If there are no other questions, I deeply thank you, Isabella, for this wonderful presentation. Really very, very useful. And I hope that this topic will be dealt with more and more in conservatories, in music schools, because it is very important, because it is all part of the musical performance. And I think it's not a small part. It's it can change the level of the performance and affect it in a great way. So again, thank you all for taking part for this beautiful conversation. And if you want to join also the other ones, there is another one next Monday, even if it's a bit difficult for Sydney people to to follow, because it is in 7 p.m. in Italy. So I think that 11 years, it is 7 a.m. Or 6 a.m. in Sydney. So maybe it's not very easy. But anyway, I will record all the conversations. So if you are interested, you can follow and listen to them in the website of my association. So, okay. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Grazie.
Bye.
Ciao,
Bye-bye.
grazie a tutti.
Ciao.
Arrivederci. Grazie.